Hi and welcome to some supplementary content for ENVS 1003-6103. More than just being a little bit of extra add-on, this content is intended to give you a little more background in terms of understanding confounding factors, in particular as they relate to your Shinrin-Yoku research critique. Remember, in that critique, you have to undertake a methodological review as well as a conceptual structural review of the theoretical framework. Part of the methodological review asks for you to consider the impact of confounding factors and whether demand characteristics have played a role in affecting the results, or whether they were considered as part of the methodology, or the method rather. Now, up to this point, we haven't really discussed either of those in great detail. So it's worth covering that now. Now, in particular, it's worth covering that content in the context of surveying people or studying people, which is the case for every one of those Shinrin-Yoku related papers that I allocated to you in week 2. So let's get started. You'll remember that from the experimental design lectures earlier in the semester, I talked through the nature of observational and experimental studies. And in particular, I talked through the attributes of observational studies in which data are collected directly through observations of existing phenomena, not through the application of an experiment. That is, we go out there, we collect data on both the response, the thing that we see change or think will change depending upon some kind of treatment, and the factor that is affecting it, potentially. So we have both an explanatory variable, something that explains an effect or explains differences between two levels or maybe more levels within the data set, as we'll see in the coming weeks. Now, the idea here is that the effect that we see in our response variable, the thing that we measure an effect in, sometimes referred to as the dependent variable, separate that use of dependent from the terms that we've used in the paired t-testing. So we assume that the effect we see in our response variable is a product of the difference in stratification between the two levels we might have on an x-axis. So if we have north and south on ridgelines in Black Mountain, we assume that differences in species composition and structure are the product of trees being on a north or a south-facing aspect. What we cannot do, however, in observational studies is take into account, in most cases, the effect of factors that co-vary with our effect of interest. So we cannot, for example, determine the effect of, say, anything else that might happen on a north-facing aspect simply by chance from the fact that it's a north-facing aspect. So we cannot distinguish non-treatment, if you like, related effects in our data. Now, let's just take a moment and just remember that observational studies do have their benefits. We apply observational studies when experiments can't be conducted, or it's too difficult, or it's just unethical to do so. However, there are these problems. Remember, first of all, this issue associated with a cognitive bias. We make observations, we think there's a difference, and then we go out and test that. There is an underlying cognitive bias there. We do seek to overcome that with the H0, the null hypothesis, to formally test that that effect is not there, but we need to recognise that there is a risk of creating a bias within our sampling method. This second issue, though, the issue of co-varying factors, is a real problem, and not one that we can easily contend with unless we apply very strict controls to the data that we include in our studies. A confounding factor is a co-varying effect. It co-varies with the effect that we have of interest. That co-varying effect is to the level that the effect of the variable under interest or of interest is masked by the effect of the co-varying variable itself. Maybe that explanation doesn't make things clear to you. So let's consider the idea of a confounding factor in a little more detail here. So here in this box, we see that confounding factors generate differences that are outside of what we have in mind as a consequence of, say, an experimental treatment. Let's think about a controlled experiment for a moment. Think about an experiment in which we might apply a treatment to animal, plant, anything else, but by virtue of applying that treatment, we also have included a non-treatment effect. Maybe some additional handling of the plant or the animal that's under treatment changes the way that it responds over time in an experiment. Think about Black Mountain, for example, Gallimbari, and think about the comparison of north and south-facing aspects if we were to test for where there are more or fewer scribbles on trees. Let's say, for example, we expect there to be more scribbles on a north-facing aspect for some reason, and that we believe that that increase in scribbles might be related to attributes of north-facing aspects. Maybe they're warmer and the moths like warmer aspects. Let's just assume that for the moment. Well, what if we find that that's true? Wow, there are more scribbles on north-facing aspects, but also at the same time there are more Eucalyptus rossii on north-facing aspects. So yes, we could account for that very easily by some data and by some data handling, but there is a second variable in here, the abundance of Eucalyptus rossii on north-facing aspects, that would mask any direct effect of north on insect abundance if we thought that north had some independent effect. What about when we go and we look at where the scribbles actually are on the bowl? And we decide, wow, look at that. Apparently, there are more scribbles on easterly sides of the bowl. Does that mean, of course, well, what that tells us is that females must be selecting easterly sides of the bowls more frequently. Well, that would only describe the effect in the context of what the female does, not what happens to the larvae once they emerge from an egg. It is entirely possible that survival is dependent upon the aspect of the tree, not the oviposition or the egg laying of the female itself. So we have two factors at play there: survival of the larvae and egg laying of the female. One factor has the potential to confound or mask or contribute to any apparent effect of the other. And we need to be very, very careful in experimental studies, but especially in observational studies, when we have confounding factors at play. So we need to, in all circumstances, look for and aim to counter or entirely eliminate confounding factors when we conduct experiments. And indeed, the idea and the art of eliminating confounding factors is the vast majority of the time spent in designing carefully conducted and well executed experiments. Bear in mind that as much as we might try, eliminating confounding factors in experiments and observational studies is a very, very difficult thing to do. Even in the most controlled circumstances, confounding factors can play a very large role. I always like to include this image when I think about confounding factors because it reminds me of an experiment that I was involved in. This experiment was part of an experiment, or this image is from an experiment that involved 4,500 seedlings that were tested for their response to elevated CO2 concentration. In that experiment, we had over time, working in this greenhouse, become well aware of a number of confounding effects, depending on where the pot was positioned in the greenhouse bay, both from a north end of the greenhouse bay or on its east-west axis. We also discovered that between rooms there was a distinct effect. So rooms that were most westerly grew fastest, as did rooms that were most easterly. Rooms in the middle that often received the CO2 treatment because those were the most airtight tended to have lower growth. And that was a product of the number of walls, of clear walls at least, but the light still had to pass through those walls, the number of walls through which the light had to pass to get to the plants. Now, we could control for that by switching plants between rooms during the experiment. It was a lot of work, but we managed to overcome the confounding effect of rooms. We also had to move the plants around the room, so within times, well, we'd move them between rooms on a weekly basis, but we had to move them within rooms on a daily basis to ensure that the effects of position in the greenhouse were accounted for. So it can be done, but bear in mind, even in an experiment like this, where we're dealing with tiny plants, the workload can be substantial. We need to take that issue on very, very seriously. What about Shinrin-yoku then? Is it possible that confounding effects or confounding variables, non-treatment related effects, come into play when we consider Shinrin-yoku? Well, let's consider a fairly typical design for a Shinrin-yoku study. Quite a few of them make use of this sort of design, where students from a university are exposed to what is regarded as the treatment. Here they're taken out perhaps to a lovely forest, as opposed to the control, being exposed to a busy streetscape. Now the question here is, if we observe a positive effect of being in a forest, that is slower heart rate, lower stress indicators, either surveyed using a survey or using quantitative health metrics, if we see a benefit of a benefit of being in a forest relative to being in the streetscape, the question becomes, which is the treatment? Are we actually seeing a stress response associated with being in a busy streetscape, or are we seeing a stress response associated with being in a forest? What is the comparison and what is the treatment? Well, it's entirely possible that both are playing out at the same time, which means we cannot attribute any effect that we see in a forest to the forest itself. It's also possible that any effect we see is purely a consequence of the sustained stress of being in an environment that is constantly grabbing our attention. Remember the attention restorative treatment, the idea that underpins one of the philosophies or one of the explanations behind Shinrin-yoku effects themselves. So are we just seeing a stress treatment? Is it a stress treatment? The question here just cannot be answered because the experiment is designed, in most of your studies, is designed not to account for that problem specifically. Now, don't just repeat what I've said in this lecture in your critique. You need to look very, very closely at your papers because some of them do take into account this effect and seek to eliminate or at least mitigate the effect on the data. So think about, when you're looking at your Shinrin-yoku paper, how might this comparison that's being demonstrated, how is the effect that I'm seeing associated with being in a forest, how is that potentially confounded by the other part of the study? What is the effect that I'm actually seeing here? That is a question that we always need to ask when we're looking at experimental data. And what have the authors, the researchers, done to eliminate any effect of a confounding variable? Now, confounding variables are particularly problematic when it comes to experimenting or studying people. Now, if you're familiar with this film, Young Einstein, you'll be very familiar with the confounding effect of, well, the ineptitude of some of the people portrayed in the film, the characters, in particular, Marty Feldman's character here. In the film, the outcome in terms of Dr. Frankenstein in this movie producing his monster, the outcome is confounded by the efforts of Marty's character, Igor. The names have changed a little bit from the traditional movie. Now, bear in mind, when we're working with people, the contribution of the researchers themselves can be a major component in generating confounding effects. Now, to understand that, the issue of confounding effects and what it might do in terms of the outcome when we study people, we need to consider the role of surveys and how we might design and conduct them. All right, so surveys are a normal part of studying people, and they're aimed at obtaining information from a population of people in a standardized way. Now, sometimes when we study people, yes, experiments are conducted, but more often than not, outside of medical fields in particular, we make observations about people, and the experiments we conduct are non-invasive. Now, bear in mind the benefits of conducting experiments, that we have this idea of internal validity, in which we conduct an experiment and we can identify, ideally, the effect of the variable under control or under treatment. Instead, in an observational studies are what we'd refer to as externally valid. And that is that we undertake a survey in which we ask questions of a population that tells us about that population itself, bearing in mind that when we conduct experiments, the results are valid for the experiment, but cannot necessarily be easily applied to the population. So we have to ask the question about whether experiments are externally valid, but of course that's not the intent of experiments. But that is a question that you need to ask of your Shinrin-yoku study. How is the balance of internal to external validity reached here? Is there balance? And if there is not, do the authors at least indicate the limitations, the internal validity of their study and the limited external validity of their work? Now, before we get started talking to people or surveying people, number one that we need to consider, and this is the case for animal studies and plant studies too now, not necessarily for invertebrate studies though, curiously, is the issue of ethics. This is a particularly important issue when we work with people. All research in which human beings are surveyed, in which a question is asked of people, even if it is part of their normal everyday activities and there is no direct effect on them other than responding to a survey question, we must have ethics approval. Your Shinrin-yoku papers should highlight, mention at some point that they have gained ethics approval through some mechanism, be it in the acknowledgements at the end or in the methods section. Ideally, they also talk through in their methods section how the ethics requirements were met in their study. The overall goal here in ethical conduct of research is to minimise or eliminate, ideally eliminate harm on respondents or participants. Now, insofar as harm on participants is concerned, one example worldwide is used over and over and over. If you've studied any kind of, if you've conducted a unit in psychology at all, you're probably already familiar with this guy, Stanley Milgram. Now, I'm not going to talk in detail about Stanley Milgram, but bear in mind that Stanley Milgram's experiments in which participants were led to believe that they were delivering electric shocks to people who were being trained to remember particular questions and responses. That study is a mainstay in considering the impacts of ethics. And there are a whole raft of things you can listen to and watch that cover the experiment and its interpretation. Now, the simple interpretation at a superficial level was that Stanley Milgram failed to meet a number of the ethical requirements associated with conducting research. And if you want that perspective, go to this Radiolab show called The Bad Show. Now you can see I've put the link here. Be advised though, I just want to issue a content warning associated with this one, that this radio show includes details about violent crime. If you want to have a slightly more balanced approach to what happened within that study and its interpretation, have a listen to this interview with Gina Perry, in which Gina dives a little more deeply into not only Stanley Milgram's behaviour, but also the way that his behaviour has been interpreted in a raft of media. But let's focus in particular on the key goals of ethics when it comes to human studies. In particular, you see these key elements, that participation in a survey, in a study, should be voluntary, and that voluntary participation needs to be gained in an open fashion by giving the participants all the information they need to make a decision about whether they want to participate or not. So there needs to be clear, informed consent, and the participants need to be given information that lets them know that at any point in time they can withdraw. So that informed consent, once given, is always allowed to be withdrawn by the participant. A key element of an ethically designed study or in practice one is one in which researchers fully disclose their identity and fully disclose the identity of the study and its intent, what the research is aiming to demonstrate and test. They might not indicate if the participant is part of the treatment or control group. And so there is a grey area in here around informed consent. And that kind of assessment around whether that is ethical or not has to be assessed by independent ethics boards, and all universities should have them, and we certainly do here at the ANU. A key element of every participant's participation in a study is that their identity is concealed within the data, and the data that are generated by the study about them is held confidentially. And as part of that, the data management itself must be ethical in terms of it mustn't be shared without permission from the participants. And if it is, the identity of the participants must be withdrawn from the data set. Now, those are the key elements here. Now, in Stanley Milgram's study, there are two elements that were really at issue. One is that the participants were not informed at the outset as to what the study actually involved. So informed consent was actually never given. The participants were deceived into participating in a study that they had not bargained on. And of course, the researchers, in doing so, deceived the participants in terms of the study's intent. Now, those are among a number of ethical problems presented by the Stanley Milgram experiments. Not the only ones, but the idea of always eliminating these issues presents a problem from an experimental point of view. But before we get to that, give consideration to how your study has aimed to meet these considerations when selecting participants who are either going to chill out here and look at a screen or go for an active walk. Another one of those designs. But there is this problem that I referred to a moment ago, a problem that is associated with the full disclosure of what we are doing in our experiments and studies of people. First among them, and this is the big one, the idea of a demand characteristic. What's a demand characteristic? Well, imagine if something is expected of you. A demand is placed upon you. And as a good participant in anything, a society or maybe a group activity, your reaction, the characteristics of your behaviour are a response to that demand. Now, I did say as a good participant, but any kind of behaviour that is a response to a demand that is placed upon you is a demand characteristic. You might respond in a positive fashion. Oh, yes, you're asking this of me. I will totally comply with what you're doing. Now, that might express itself in a number of ways. Maybe in a survey, if you have an expectation of what is required in terms of the experiment, maybe your behaviour, maybe your responses, verbal responses to a questionnaire will be positive so that the researcher's hypotheses are proven. Maybe when a demand is put upon you, if you disagree with the idea, you're going to do everything you can to counter that demand. So demand characteristics can go either way. And they're not restricted to people. For many, many, many years, for hundreds of years, we've assumed that plants are passive participants in experiments. That is, they don't interact with the researcher when an experimental treatment is applied to them. Well, if you go into the Robertson building right now, on the right-hand side as you walk from the front door to the undergraduate teaching lab, you'll walk past one of these, a sensitive mimosa plant. And if you walk past and you touch the leaves, you just sort of do this on the leaves, they'll fold up and they'll drop. So a trait of this plant is to close up and make the leaves unavailable when something physically brushes against it. It's a response to, trying to keep your leaves safe from things that want to eat them. But surely these things, they're out in the wind all the time, being blown around, and if they're out in the wind making contact with each other, surely, well, that'd be slightly counterproductive. Well, yes, it would be, because that would reduce photosynthetic uptake. So could these plants learn? Well, yes, they can. And these studies here from Gagliano and a number of co-authors, they're at University of Adelaide, demonstrated that if you engage with these plants enough prior to an experimental test, they will modify their behaviour in response to subsequent treatments. So that is, they learn what is required of them and counter that. So they have a negative demand characteristic. Now, that result is so contested among people who work on plants. A lot of people have ignored it, some have contested it, but these co-authors, they continue to chip away at this. The issue is that we need to consider, even in the case of plants, where we might be generating a demand characteristic. It's more important, of course, when we deal with animals, and of those animals, humans. So what are some demand characteristics? Well, consider this list here, where we have the good subject, where a participant tries to help the researchers by confirming the hypothesis, maybe giving the answers that the researcher wants, or if it's a medical study, doing extra things to improve the quality of the effect observed in them. Perhaps on the flip side, there's the negative subject, or the person who has what is often referred to as the screw you effect, where they disagree with the hypothesis and do everything they can do to counter it. And then we have the apprehensive and the faithful subjects. A person who, well, they're engaged with the study and they don't want to be regarded negatively, so they try to give the best results that they think the researcher wants. And then the faithful subject, the person who behaves exactly the way that they would if they didn't know the researcher's hypotheses. Now, these are 4 different categories of demand characteristic. Obviously, we'd like people to be faithful subjects, but we don't want them to try to act the way they would if they didn't know the researcher's hypotheses. Ideally, we don't want them to know the research hypothesis so that there are no demand characteristics. So that is, we need to conceal the research hypothesis from them. We have a problem. We need to rely on deception sometimes. But is that ethical? Can we apply deception ethically? Can we still meet these principles and apply deception to get the results we want without, and that is the results that lack the effect of demand characteristics? Well, it's a tricky thing. Yes, it can be, but it must be assessed by an ethics committee. Typically, deceptive practices that are approved are those in which full disclosure of what the experiment aimed to do is delayed until the treatment has been fully applied and the effect measured, or the timing of the measurement is delayed or earlier than the participant is informed that the measurement will be made. So in some cases, deliberate misinformation can be applied to participants, but there are real caveats on whether, or rather on how it is deployed. Bear in mind these considerations that really determine whether deception can be and how it is applied. It can really only be applied when there are no other non-deceptive techniques that are going to help. What I think is a poor reason, but it is a real reason applied. If the study is going to, or the outcome of the study is going to make a really important contribution to some kind of medical treatment or perhaps some level of scientific knowledge, then deception can be often approved, but only of particular types. Deception must not have any kind of significant harm in any way, and when I say significant, it cannot harm the participants. So you can't produce any kind of emotional distress or physical harm. And the deception itself must be explained to the participants while they are part of the study, immediately once the measurements have been made. All right, if we've got all that under control, then often the way that studies are conducted in non-experimental circumstances is to conduct a survey. Of course, there are many medical studies that are conducted, but bear in mind, in environmental settings in which surveys of people are conducted, those experiments aren't conducted. We make observational studies based upon surveys. And those surveys, in addition to measuring the effect that we're interested in, also aim to collect data on potential confounding variables. Things about the population's demography that explain or have the potential to explain differences between treatment and control groups if we have some kind of natural experiment, or have the capacity to explain the effect of interest itself. So we have experiments that aim to collect research data as well as collecting demographic data to help explain any effects that we see. Remember that comparison between observational studies and experimental studies, well, surveys fall within that externally valid kind of approach where, while we don't have an experiment that will explain what's going on internally within the experiment, we have something that applies to the population and can be used to interpret attributes of that population. Within the survey, all sorts of questions can be asked about the attributes of the person, their age, and all sorts of physical attributes, through to personal beliefs and knowledge and attitudes towards certain questions. And the intent then is to identify relations or relationships between those responses and demographic data. The problem here, of course, in being externally valid but not internally valid is that survey-based data often lack the experimental power to generate a causal explanation of what's going on. But bear in mind that surveys aren't always just observational. Many of your studies, for example, make use of mood-based surveys, perhaps the Montreal study, the Montreal survey, the MOCA survey, and you'll find that many of them do that, and they are part of an experimental treatment. So just because we're using a survey doesn't eliminate its placement within an actual control and treatment research, a piece of research. Now, when we design a survey, of course, you don't design a survey in this course, and any reference to surveys in your Shinrin-yoku studies simply refer to we use this Montreal protocol, and you'll see that Montreal protocol used quite a lot. Now, in designing surveys, survey designers consider a great many things, just as people who measure vegetation or plants in natural settings consider the implications of the data collection methods they use. Bearing in mind that we're talking to people and using terms, words, phrases that might be interpreted differently between individuals, the number one thing for us to consider when designing surveys is to get the wording absolutely right, so that the participants, the respondents, respond to the question in the way that we want them to. Not in terms of whether they say yes or no to a particular question, but that they understand the question in the frame in which we mean it, and their response is given in a way that we understand it. So if they say yes to a question, they understand and respond yes to the question that is being asked of us, not their interpretation of the question. And when they say yes or no, our interpretation of that response is consistent with the way that they mean it. And this is a great deal, this is a great area of design work that goes on within surveys, ensuring that, for example, the topic and the terms within the surveys themselves are defined clearly, and that the respondents themselves have all the information about the terms, the intent, the questions they're being asked that they need to be able to answer a question in an appropriate fashion. So everything is defined using appropriate definitions, perhaps definitions defined in law or that are well understood. We never use terms that are implied. We need respondents to respond in an appropriate fashion, and we avoid bias associated with information problems. So the issue of information bias, where we think we're measuring something, but we're actually capturing data on something else, consistent with that issue of elections that I highlighted way back in week 3, the issue of information bias is eliminated in the design of the survey. So respondents need to clearly understand the questions as we intend them. And of course, the respondents themselves need to be willing to answer. We need to design our surveys and conduct them in a way that leave our respondents willing to engage with the survey, the time they have, and the genuine perspectives they have as well. Now, there's a statement here around closed questions. A closed question shouldn't be overlapping and so on. Now, what is a closed question? Well, these closed questions are classic components of survey design, and no doubt you've responded to closed questions before. If you've completed a student evaluation of learning, for example, you have responded to a closed question. You see, a closed question in a survey is a pre-coded response in which a limited range of responses are left open to you and you select from one of those. They might be a yes or no, or some kind of arbitrary sort of category where you choose one that you like the most, or some kind of ranked order where you select the least likely to the most likely. Maybe you're responding to a course and you make a decision about whether you were satisfied all the way through to very unsatisfied. Now, those kind of responses are our pre-coded or closed questions. And they are suitable to quantitative analyses, but suitable to a particular family of quantitative analyses known as non-parametric analyses. Now, we will cover non-parametric analyses in the latter part of this course, but put briefly, a non-parametric statistic is one that we calculate for data that lack a distribution. So like our diameter distributions, because they're continuous data, they have a continuous distribution. Now, data that come from surveys that are ordinal or nominally based, so you can see a rank order here, or from different categories that people just select what they like most or feel most strongly about, those are nominal. Now, we cannot generate means and standard deviations based upon those data. They're non-numeric and they're non-continuous. So we need a completely different family of statistics. We will introduce some of those towards the end of the course. But before we move on to some issues associated with them, let's remember some of the things that we need to bear in mind when deciding a closed question. That is that the closed questions need to include all the possible responses that a person might give to that question. It needs to include the full range as well as all the possible categories or a meaningful set of categories in between those extremes. The categories need to avoid any kind of overlap, so you can't have duplicating possibilities in which two things might be true simultaneously, and they cannot overlap. There mustn't be any ambiguity between what the categories mean, and if there is, those terms need to be clearly explained so that there is no misinterpretation. Now, the general assumption is that the categories themselves offer an equal range of choices. Now, there's a great deal of argument whether pre-coded or closed questions, especially those that fall within this Likert scale, actually achieve that. Now, what is a Likert scale then? Well, a Likert and a semantic scale are two of the most commonly used scaling techniques in surveys. A Likert scale, for example, in which you are asked to select from one of a series of ranked categories. In here, commonly, say a top, and say 5 categories from which you strongly agree through to strongly disagree. You see these kind of surveys used all the time, used by companies, businesses, the ANU, to collect information about your perspective of their services. Different to that is the semantic differential scale, in which you are given the two ends of the scale and then asked to make a judgment about falling where you fall somewhere along that scale. Now, there's a great deal of argument about these two scales. The first argument is whether the Likert scale offers that equal choice opportunity. So, does the strongly agree category represent a broader or a narrower set of possibilities to the agree group? Is the neutral group, does that represent a larger range of possibilities or a very narrow set? Can anyone actually truly be neutral in an experience that they've had? So might that be a very narrow band? So we need to be aware that just because they're worded equally or appear equal, that doesn't mean that what those terms mean to each participant can be viewed as equal in terms of, well, I would have an equal range of being strong, having a strong disagreement, to the range that would categorise my disagreement, and the range of being neutral, agree, or strongly agree. There's no difference in the range of possibilities that those categories cover. I don't believe that's true. The assumption that that is true is the underlying assumption of, well, that assumption affects the way that we analyse the data. Bear in mind here that yes, the data here or the options here are ranked, but they're ranked nominal observations. So yes, we can treat them as an ordinal category. We cannot, however, treat them as a continuous variable. Why? Well, because the intervals are not defined, and you can almost guarantee that the intervals, that is, the range over which I might define agree or strongly agree, would differ to the next person who does a survey. So we have non-constant intervals, and the way that those intervals apply between individuals is also not constant. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because, of course, it impacts upon the way that we analyse the data that come from them. It is not possible, for example, to analyse ordinal data using, say, means or standard deviations. It's not continuous data. So a Likert scale should never be converted to means and standard deviations. It's meaningless from that point of view. Unfortunately, someone forgot to tell people here at ANU that. Just like many surveys of student perspective on courses, the history of student surveys here at the ANU included a quantitative analysis, a continuous quantitative analysis of student opinions of their courses. What does a mean calculated between category 4 and 5 here, what does a mean of 4.4 actually mean? Nothing. Because the definition of category 4 and 5 is so subjective that, well, it differs between every individual, and we don't actually know what that interval means. But it's not just the ANU who does it. This kind of application or use of, or misuse of Likert or survey data is spread throughout all forms of surveys and their interpretation. Here, one that is focused on the use of culling for conservation of grassland and woodland communities. The authors here, these consultants that reported to the ACT government, ended up just calculating a mean that compared the mean response of participants between 2 years of 2011 to 2015 and used it to indicate a general movement towards greater agreement or support for the government's culling of kangaroos. And you can see here that the value shifted from an agreement score of 3.74 to 3.96. Now, there is no way of interpreting what that means. First of all, these values here, these categories are non-numeric. How is the score assigned to these things to start with? Is I don't know included in that score? And then aside from that, where the heck is the confidence interval? If we are going to treat things as numeric, then we need to go the whole hog here. We can't pick and choose. Obviously, you can hear from my voice, I don't really put much weight in what came out of this piece of work. Now, that's not to say that you can't do something with this, but you can't do that. So how do we extract information from people? Are we stuck with these closed techniques, or can we get that information out of them some other way? Well, yes, if we've talked about closed questions, then we must have other techniques open to us. We have open questions. If the survey designs that we have are not sufficient for us to extract the information, to tame the respondents the way that we want them, open questions are preferred. And the use of open questions is the domain of people who are particularly skilled at designing surveys. The open question itself is far less structured, but insofar as it has no defined responses. So there's no categories that respondents respond to. Rather, their opinion is asked. The question is there, but the interviewee is allowed to respond however they see appropriate. Now, we need to exercise caution here. Again, the definition and terms need to be defined so that there is a response by the interviewee that falls within or is consistent with the definitions used by the interviewer to outline their question. Now, surveys that use open questions can generate fantastic textual data that do a number of things. Yes, textual data can open pathways to understanding effects, but they do more than that. They let researchers interpret from the responses of individuals the things that drive those effects. So open questions, textual questions, offer the opportunity to explore not only effects but their causes as well in a non-experimental form. Because as human beings speaking the same language, using the same terms, we can explore ideas. We can extract information not just about the population we're interested in, but about individual circumstances. We can understand that thing that we started talking about in the first few weeks. We can understand what the causes, the sources of intrinsic population error might be. And in subsequent surveys, we could seek to minimise that error. We could understand why intrinsic error exists. That's not something we can do with plants and animals all that well. Of course, all of this complex, rich information comes with a great deal of complexity. You need to be able to decode that textual information and interpret it in a fashion that is informative. And that is complicated and in many cases subjective in nature. Now, can you learn how to do that? Because we don't cover that in this course. Well, other courses in the Fenner School do cover that. I suggest if you're interested in something like that, you look into Lorraine van Kerkhoff's course, ENVS 1008. One of the things we need to be careful about in particular when it comes to open questions is the way that our questions are phrased, or the survey in total is phrased. Understanding, for example, that the things that we say and the role that we play as the researcher can have a direct impact upon the interviewee is an important element of conducting surveys as well as designing them. Sometimes surveys are focused upon very sensitive topics, and sometimes even the direct nature of the wording that is required so that the topic and terms are clearly defined, well, can be too direct in sensitive topics, or even in topics that are fairly banal in nature. Wording that is too direct or seems callous can be inappropriate, or rather is inappropriate in surveys. And so we need to be very careful about the language we use. In the way that surveys are conducted, we need to be careful about the relationship that we build with the interviewee as the interview is being conducted. Especially where topics relating of a personal nature are the focus of the study, we need to be careful about establishing a rapport, because if we don't, then a respondent is unlikely to offer up the information that we might have of interest. And in studies where personal information is given, particularly of sensitive information, we need to really emphasise issues around anonymity, confidentiality, and emphasise the safety associated with our individual survey design and conduct. And of course, we need to be very careful with our use of language to avoid objectionable terms. Outside of that, there are, of course, grammatical considerations that we need to bear in mind too. So simple ideas around using leading language that encourages a particular response, using questions that are double-barreled, that ask effectively two things, like, do you think Australians should eat less? Maybe. And exercise more? Well, actually, I don't think that they should eat less and exercise more, because if they exercise more, then they might have to eat more to counter the effect of the additional exercise and the energy. Anyway, a double question here would not be particularly helpful. What about using a double negative? Are you against a ban on... Wait a minute, Emma, it's not a ban, it's not a... Double negatives never work. They're very, very confusing. Always seek to eliminate double negatives in conversation, but also in writing, especially when it comes to asking people for clear responses. If you want to confuse someone, you use a double negative. It's not help. Anyway. Also avoid the use of leading questions in which you artificially generate potential demand characteristics. Maybe questions that generate social desirability in the responses, such as, do you agree with the majority of us that this thing should happen? And if you don't, what's wrong with you? You cannot include that kind of language. Last, this issue of how is your survey offering equal choices? Have you created language that, at least on the interviewee side, a response one way is not equal to a response in the other direction? That doesn't sound that's not a very good explanation, is it? To understand what I mean by this, I want to give you an example. Two examples. Consider this issue of unequal choice. Most of you won't remember this, but in 1999 we had a referendum on whether Australia was going to move to become a republic. You know, get rid of the monarchy and have a head of state of our own. Good idea. We were asked whether it was a good idea, and I remember voting on it. Now, at the time, unfortunately, two people who were very prominent in the Australian scene at that point in time had very different views on whether we should be a republic or not, and they also had sort of views about each other as well. Those two people were John Howard, who was the Prime Minister at the time, and Malcolm Turnbull, who became a Prime Minister subsequently. Now, Malcolm Turnbull supported the Republican move. John Howard, still to this day, is a very staunch monarchist. Now, after going through the process of working up the wording, and against a background of disagreement within Republicans about who the head of state could be and how they might be selected, John Howard came up with this wording himself. And that is to alter the Constitution to establish the Commonwealth of Australia as a republic. That should have been the question. But no. The extra text here, with the Queen and Governor-General being replaced by a President, appointed by a 2/3 majority of the members of Commonwealth Parliament. Do you approve with this alteration? Well, what is being asked here? Is the question, do you want to alter the Constitution to make Australia a republic? Yes or no? Well, that's not what's being asked. There are two options at play here. 1, do you want a republic? No. 2, do you want a republic? Yes. And if you do you want a president? And do you want that appointed by these people, parliamentarians? And do you want this particular process for this election? And do you want this minimum number of people to approve it? The options here are in no way equal. No and yes would have been equal, not the no and yes with an armload of caveats, because by creating these caveats, the yes vote was splintered into many factions that then went, well, no, I do want a republic, but I don't want these specific circumstances or these particular components. So my answer to this is, well, if I definitely don't want that, then my answer has to be no. And so the result of the referendum looked like this across Australia, which is a familiar way that referenda go in Australia, where the inner cities responded green, yes, and the rest of the country said no. Compare that to the same-sex marriage plebiscite a couple of years ago in 2018, the Australian Marriage Law Postal Survey, in which Malcolm Turnbull, again, a man who loves a referendum or a plebiscite, Malcolm Turnbull, again, was involved in the plebiscite, in which the question was asked simply, should the law be changed to allow same-sex couples to marry? There wasn't a whole raft of caveats around that, but it was a simple yes-no question. The question here is balanced insofar as we are just being asked to respond to one thing, not a multiple set of circumstances. That is not to say that the postal survey itself, or the no campaign associated with the campaign, didn't seek to conflate the yes vote with a number of other elements. For example, politically aligned opposition to the plebiscite itself and, well, interest group disinformation sought to counter the plebiscite with questions around how the outcomes might affect access to in vitro fertilisation services. So is IVF going to be affected? What about the impact upon education policies? A whole raft of things were raised as possible associated components of the plebiscite. Now, at the time, the political will at the time, Malcolm Turnbull and others at the time, as well as the Yes campaign, successfully countered these kind of campaigns, as well as campaigns by people who were at the time prominent within the Liberal Party, one of the political parties here, voices that sought again to conflate the vote on marriage equality with religious freedoms. Now, let's be clear. The vote on marriage equality had nothing to do with these issues. It had everything to do with equality in the Australian community. And appropriately, happily, the answer was yes from the community. This time, the terms were defined clearly, and the work associated with the Yes team and the people running the survey itself, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, aimed to eliminate any kind of sense of confusion around the wording. So this is, if you hadn't considered it before this way, this is a survey design and conduct issue to ensure that we eliminate the effect of information bias in the way that surveys are conducted and the results are gained. A win for everyone, including people who love minimising error associated with data. And if you are interested in minimizing error associated with data, you need to be aware of the potential sources of bias within all surveys. And you can see here, as we go around this loop here, the idea of demand bias we've already talked about. Demand characteristics associated with behaviours on the part of the interviewees depending upon their impression of what the experiment or the study is about, what the hypotheses are. Then we have social desirability, a response that is not associated with the hypothesis, but an effect associated with people behaving the way that they think the community wants them to behave. The flip side of that, of course, is the dissent bias. People who respond opposite to the way that they think society wants them or the researchers want them to behave, simply because they disagree with any one of a number of circumstances that might have absolutely nothing to do with the survey itself. For example, if you think that a survey is, for example, put together for the benefit of a left or right-leaning political group and you're part of the opposite group, then you might say anything to dissent from a view that is associated with that opposing political group. The acquiescence bias, in which you're totally ambivalent either way, you don't have the time, you don't care, and you just give in to whatever you think is appropriate at the time. You just don't care. You are so neutral to be ineffective as part of a survey, even though you might have a response. Now, the acquiescence bias is one of two biases that are often seen in surveys, for example, in student surveys. Many students will, as they fill out in a neutral position if a survey is mandatory. They don't know one way or the other, they're not invested, and so they just put in neutral in the middle. We've all done that in the past when we're not engaged in something, but we have to do it. Alternatively, when a survey is voluntary, we are likely to get people who have very, very strong opinions either side. Now that might balance out, but then we end up with loads of extreme responses. An element associated with that is also neutral responding, in which the responses themselves, either through confusion or lack of care, just respond neutrally. And then we have a whole suite of personal biases associated with individuals who come into surveys. But a big personal bias is the bias associated with the interviewer themselves. Now, the interviewer can, of course, impact upon the responses of the respondents themselves. Bear in mind that an interviewer and their relationship with the person can gravely impact upon the respondent's outcome, especially where there is a power relationship or an assumed outcome on the part of the person who is asking the question of the person who is being interviewed. If there is a power disconnect between the interviewee and the interviewer. Now, a power relationship almost always exists in these things, and interviewers need to be very careful of something that we refer to as positionality. Now, I'm not going to talk about positionality here, but I will put online for you to review this week as well, a lecture by Shun Pham, in which Shun talks through the issues of positionality. That's an optional piece, and it's an interesting one, but one that maybe you have a look at if you're interested in the issue of positionality, the impact, for example, of political power, of social power, and what it can do to researchers' outcomes as part of surveys. But in general, understand that we all have our own tone, our own style of speech, and that has impacts upon people. So it is absolutely important that even if you're asking open questions or closed questions, but especially open questions, we need to have clearly defined language and a consistent method of delivery. That requires clearly and well-trained interviewers and very, very well-designed surveys in which surveys that have multiple topics are broken down into components, because these issues become worse as the survey becomes more complicated. Now, the next few slides highlight an example of bias or potential bias in a survey that was reported a few years ago. The survey was conducted on the incidence of sexual assault and harassment on university campuses. If you find that topic or feel that that topic will be difficult for you to listen to, then this is the right time to stop the lecture here. Understand that by not watching this content, you're not going to miss out on any content that is of relevance or weighting to the assessment. Well, the Change the Course survey, released several years ago now, aimed to study the incidence of sexual harassment and assault on university campuses. And I can say, as an academic, as a teacher at the time, I was absolutely shocked at the results. The prevalence of sexual harassment and assault on campuses was far, far greater than I had considered possible before. Any level of sexual harassment and assault is unacceptable, but the level that we were made aware of when this report came out was truly shocking to many of us. Now, as a consequence of, let's come back to this slide. As a consequence of this report, and also bear in mind that you can access the Change the Course response through the Human Rights Commission website. Now, when the report came out, there was appropriately responses and genuine responses by Vice Chancellors around Australia, and in particular here at the ANU. And I say in particular here at the ANU because the rates of sexual harassment and assault were higher here than anywhere else in the country. Now, as Vice Chancellors and others in the community responded to the Change the Course report, others within the community responded differently. A number of commentators in the media, people such as, if you're familiar with them, Andrew Bolt and Bettina Arndt, commentators for the Australian paper, and Andrew Bolt is a commentator for Sky News Channel, as well as a number of other news outlets, including Crikey.com, published material that raised questions about the validity and interpretation of the Change the Course report. Now, I want to say, first of all, that as a researcher, we must always ask questions of the validity of the nature of bias and error within our data sets. And so, asking questions about bias within a data set, that's certainly permissible. But let's examine the criticisms, the allegations of bias that were raised around the Change the Course report. The allegations were of two types. Let's look at the first one. The first allegation of bias was around the alleged responder bias. Now, we talked about responder bias early in this course. Responder bias in which people who have personal experience and strong feelings about whatever it is the survey is asking have a greater likelihood of responding. Now, in this survey, the allegation was that people who had experienced sexual harassment or assault were more likely to respond. And as a consequence, the reported rates of assault or harassment were higher than they should be regarded within the broader population. That is, the allegation here was that the survey results were not externally valid. Now, surely if the Human Rights Commission was involved in this work and serious researchers were involved, surely they understand statistics and surveys enough to consider that possibility. Yes, well, they did. And what they did, they analysed about the ratio between the number of reports of assault or harassment against the overall response rates at a university level. The idea here is that if you have a higher reporting incidence and you also have a higher response rate, then that might indicate a positive bias. That is, a bias in which you have a greater frequency of assault or harassment reports embedded within the data. Of course, if you have less frequent reporting, or you have more frequent reports of harassment and violence in cases in which you have fewer response in total, then you have a negative bias. So that means that, well, you have lots of reports and you don't have many respondents, then something is happening in a different direction. So we can test the data to assess whether we have a positive bias, that is, whether the incidence of harassment or assault is contributing to response rates or it is reducing response rates. So let's have a look. So the issue here, summarised by some text from the crikey.com website, is summarised this way. That the higher proportion of reports from universities with higher response rates, well, there's positive bias within the data. Well, the researchers tested this and they found that yes, there is evidence for positive bias within the data set. And even Crikey acknowledged that the researchers themselves split the data up into male and non-male data. Now, what they found, of course, was that there was bias, but this is perhaps not naturally obvious, that the bias was particularly positive among male respondents. And in fact, the bias was only present within male respondents. When female-only respondents were examined, or the results from females only was considered, the bias disappeared entirely. Now, the question then becomes why? Well, that was harassment. Now, in particular, when we come to reports of assault, the bias moves in the opposite direction. Not for males, but for female respondents, the bias moves in the other direction. That is, there was a negative bias, such that the report concluded that females who had experienced assault were less likely to report that assault. So that negative bias, rather than an over-reporting bias alleged by Crikey and others, there was more likely an under-reporting. So even the numbers we saw in the Change the Course report were lower than what the actual population is experiencing, even worse than we discovered. And you see here, Crikey highlight that very same result, that only in the case of women respondents, female respondents they mean, does the report argue for a lack of response. That is the case. Now, what issue does Crikey have with this? What issue did Andrew Bolt and Bettina Arndt have with this? Well, their argument was that males in the survey represented a relatively similar proportion of the overall population. Of the population, not of the survey, but of the population of human beings at universities. Whether that's true or not, well, my experience is that it's not true. But aside from that, when we look at the frequency of assault reports, the distribution is very much non-equal. The vast majority of reports of assault are against females, not males. And so any underreporting for females by far outweighs any over-reporting that the Crikey authors allege. So how do they account for this? Well, their simple statement is that they don't understand what the researchers are saying. That is, only in the case of women respondents does the report argue for a lack of response bias, using an argument that cannot really be assessed by non-specialists. That is, we don't understand what they say, so it must be wrong. Sorry, Crikey, you're going to have to do better than that, because if you are going to critique something and you're going to publish it, at least try to keep up. The simple fact is, and it is well understood, Crikey, that non-response bias is a fact, is a reality in sexual assault data. And that is because the experience of harassment and assault is traumatic. And many of those who survive, who experience assault and harassment, find the experience of reporting it and living through it too traumatic to go through the process of reporting. Crikey, do better. I did say that there are two criticisms. The first one was rubbish. What about the second one? Well, the second one goes to the heart of survey design rather than survey responses. The criticism here was that the survey was biased from a definitional perspective, that the definition of sexual assault in the survey was too broad, was inappropriate. In some way, it inflated the estimates themselves. Now, the crux of the definition that the people like Crikey and others had at issue here is that assault occurs when a person is forced, coerced, or tricked into sexual activities or acts against their will or without their consent, including when they have withdrawn their consent. Now, that definition appeared to be too broad for Crikey, widened things too much. But again, Crikey, let's try to keep up. That definition is not something the researchers made up. It is not some kind of bias associated with the individuals who were putting it together. That definition is the accepted legal definition across Australian states and territories. And in fact, if you want an example, here we have the ACT policing website in which the very same terms are used. In fact, in 2022, the definitions in federal law were redefined to ensure that this idea, here we have the 2022 amendment that shifted the principle of consent as something that is presumed to the principle of negation. So consent can never be assumed, and that is enshrined in law. So were the definitions unclear? Well, no. Participants were given clear access to both federal and state and territory law focused on the definition of assault. The terms were clearly defined within the survey and they were externally valid. That is, they reflected what is defined as assault within the community. Either way you cut this, assault and harassment on campuses and in the community in general needs to be treated as it is, as a serious matter. and arguing over issues of rates is irrelevant. Now, while I'm on the topic, it is appropriate for me now to highlight that the ANU has a dedicated Respectful Relations group at the ANU. Make sure that you are familiar with the nature of rights and the expectations of respect at the ANU. Also, understand that the ANU has formal and clear reporting pathways open to people who experience sexual assault and harassment on campus. And last, if anything that I've talked about presents an issue for you, please be aware of a number of urgent crisis support numbers that are presented just here. Reach out and get help when you need it.